Responding to student behaviours. This video includes types of behaviours, different types of interventions, restorative practice, consequences, behaviour triggers and de-escalation. There's a lot in this video and I hope it will be very useful to you. Student behaviour ranges from positive, inclusive, respectful behaviour, the sort of behaviour we want, to serious behaviours of concern. And behaviours are generally divided into 4 types. Positive, inclusive, respectful behaviours, low-level, age-appropriate misbehaviours, challenging and disruptive behaviours, and serious behaviours of concern. There are universal strategies for all young people, and they include the explicit teaching of behavioural expectations. So this is not just putting a set of rules or a set of expectations up on the wall or even reading them out to a group of boarders. It's about actually teaching them. What does this mean? What is the expectation? How are they supposed to do this? That sort of thing. Clear boundaries in place, high rates of acknowledgement and processes of acknowledgement for good behaviours, positive behaviours, consistent routines, effective engagement and active supervision. So let's unpack those behaviours. The first behaviour was positive, inclusive and respectful behaviours. These behaviours should be identified and recognised. They're the sort of behaviours that we want. Low-level, developmentally appropriate misbehaviours that test the boundaries, etc. It's things like boarders being unruly or noisy, those sort of things that you'd expect from young people of that age, but they're not appropriate still, those behaviours. They're usually simple to redirect and to minimise, and you can use those universal behaviour support strategies and of course careful use of consequences. So consequence for this sort of behaviour might just be speaking to a young person. It could even be hand signals, those sort of consequences for that sort of low-level behaviour. Then we have challenging behaviours that are of a greater concern due to their severity, frequency or duration, and they require more persistent guidance and support. And the sort of thing here is where a student has ignored an instruction or disrupted another student in their task or their activity or whatever they're doing. And the sort of responses include positive behaviour interventions. We're going to talk more about those in a minute. Careful use of consequences and targeted intervention. So a targeted intervention is just really what it says. It targets that particular behaviour. Then we have complex and unsafe behaviours, behaviours of concern that are severe behaviours or high frequency, extended duration behaviours, and they're unsafe for young people and those around them. And we're talking here about a young person assaulting another person, a young person using drugs or alcohol in boarding, that sort of thing. Now these require some sort of assessment, like a functional behaviour assessment, individual behaviour plans, targeted strategies and consequences. Parents are going to be involved, parents or guardians, and you may even refer them on to other professionals who can help them. Now, all of these programs should include positive behaviour support, and as we've already said, this is about defining and teaching the expected behaviours, encouraging the expected behaviours with acknowledgement, reward systems, reinforcement, consistent routines, interesting, engaging activities, and effective and active supervision. And they are positive ways that we can support behaviour. We're going to look at some examples of positive behaviour interventions. The first of these is routines. So just having clear routines, induct students into routines, particularly when they first arrive and at the start of each year, possibly sometimes even the start of terms, depending what the routine is. Give opportunity to practice routines, provide ongoing support for routines and expected behaviour. Take a break. Sometimes when overwhelmed or overly stimulated, it just may benefit young people just to take a break from a task or whatever they're doing, a bit of time for self-management and self-regulation. It allows young people to pause, reflect and adjust behaviour. Silent signals. And I use these, and I think they're great to develop your own silent signals. And this could be sort of holding a finger up in the air, your index finger, for attention, or a hand up for stop. But people create their own silent signals just to remind young people to pay attention or to follow a direction. This can be for the whole group or just for one student. And it's effectively to quickly reinforce expectations with minimal disruption. And then proximity, I also use this. This is a good silent intervention. If a young person is not behaving in the way that you would like them to, you can just get physically closer and redirect their behaviour. And then quiet correction. Some negative behaviour can just be seeking attention. So you can quietly whisper an instruction to a student, and there is no audience because the other students don't know what you've said. So there's no audience involvement. And it also removes the possibility of shame or losing faith because no one else has heard what you've said. You keep control of the situation and you maintain the student's privacy. So that sort of quiet correction is very useful and very effective. Give a task. Sometimes it's useful just to give a task or an errand. This gives the young person a chance to reset and come back changed. Or sometimes pairing the young person up with a buddy as a helper can build leadership and community skills. When we're doing this, we should be trying to use positive phrasing. So instead of saying, "Don't run in the hall," we would say something like, that is more positive. "We always walk in the hall," that sort of thing. So phrase whatever we're going to say in a positive way. Rewards can be effective to encourage positive behaviours. You need clear guidelines on how to earn rewards and realistic goals. So if you're doing this in boarding, boarders need to know how that works, how they're going to earn rewards, etc. And rewards can be a tangible reward, from actually giving them something to giving them extra time on the computers, or different things like that. And then ignoring. One option is to ignore appropriate behaviours. And I can remember when I first went out teaching, there was a student who used to sit in the class and just tap on the desk with a pencil. And he was just doing it to annoy me. And so the best way to deal with that behaviour was to ignore it. There are little basic guidelines or rules for ignoring. So while you're ignoring, give the student no recognition. So that's no eye contact, no physical contact in any way, or don't acknowledge the student in any way. So you have to be consistent. So if you're ignoring that behaviour once and then paying attention the next time, then that will increase the intensity. So be consistent. And then as soon as the student has stopped the unacceptable behaviour, then you recognise them. You always combine ignoring with encouraging positive behaviours. Never ignore behaviour that could harm a person or damage property. Never ignore behaviour that is a clear breach of residence rules. So it can be difficult doing this, and it doesn't always render immediate results, but it requires all the supervisors to have the same sort of approach. So if you're going to ignore a behaviour, then everybody should ignore that same behaviour, rather than some people ignore it and other people focus on it. So we do have an activity for this video, and I hope you've downloaded this sheet. And what we're going to do for this part of the video is to look at these positive behaviour interventions: routine, take a break, silent signals, etc. And just indicate, do you use that now? And also indicate, how could I use that positive behaviour intervention? Could I use it? Is it appropriate for my context, for my borders? How could I use it? So if you can fill that in, that would be great. A bit of inappropriate behaviour from that cat. When we look at how we respond to behaviours, there is a continuum from authoritarian right down one end to self-regulating right up the other end. So there's this line or continuum from authoritarian to self-regulating, and most boarding residences are not at either end, but will be somewhere along that line. Self-regulating, this is one extreme. This is young person centered. It's where young people choose, and it's where they self-regulate their behavior as much as possible. They're responsible for their own behavior because they care for and respect themselves. They respect other people and their feelings. They value relationships, and they respect belongings and property, etc. Authoritarian, up the other end, is adult-centered. The adult's in charge. They've got strict rules and expectations, very demanding but not responsive, don't express much warmth or nurturing, utilize punishments with little or no explanation, don't give young people choices or options. So how do we achieve these? With self-regulating, support and train young people to make positive behaviour choices, empower to build self-control and self-regulation so that they can manage their own behaviour. You can see that this is, where you would want to at least be moving towards. Authoritarian, on the other hand, the adult has the authority, they make the rigid rules, they punish people, etc., etc. The authoritarian style is the least effective according to most research, because they've got high expectations and strict rules, and they expect these to be followed without explanation. They often utilise punishment rather than restoration, often not willing to explain the reasoning behind the rules, and they miss many opportunities to listen, train, and to build relationship. So authoritarian, least effective. Self-regulation, this is the ideal way to enable and encourage young people to choose responsible behaviour for the right reasons, caring for themselves, respecting other people, valuing relationships, etc. This strategy means that you're supporting and training young people to make positive choices. You give them responsibility to manage their own behaviour as much as possible, and there's room to build self-control and self-regulation. Ways to empower students to self-regulate their own behaviour is to cut back on adults regulating and policing, cut back on visible signs of rules and regulations, model and teach how to make good decisions and solve problems, don't immediately apply consequences, give a referral to talk privately about the problem and discuss strategies for making it right, and there's a higher likelihood of a student changing their behaviour if you use this strategy, emphasising and acknowledging positive behaviour and effort as you go. You can assist students to reflect on their behaviour and to evaluate their behaviour. The restorative justice framework helps young people reflect and be accountable, and it helps restore relationships. But this does take more time. It may need more meetings with the students. The student may choose the wrong behaviour again before they eventually learn from the positive behaviour. So this requires patience and quite a bit of work. On the activity sheet, you can see the continuum there, and if you can try and indicate on there where you think your residence is, and maybe if you're different to your residence, put where you are as well. And then if you can answer that question there, are you happy with where you are? And give a reason for it. The next part of this video is about consequences. Responding to behaviour with consequences can teach a young person to take responsibility for their actions and make positive choices. There are two types of consequences: logical and natural. A natural consequence has no adult involvement, it occurs naturally. So a student forgets to take his weekend leave form in, so he misses out on leave. No adult caused that. It was caused because he didn't put his form in on time. A student spends all his pocket money on the first day and he's got nothing left for the weekend. And so we need to let young people learn from those natural consequences, not protect them from those consequences. A logical consequence is when an adult asks what is a logical consequence that flows from the poor behaviour. So if a student paints graffiti on a wall, ask what will fix it. They clean off the graffiti. That's a consequence, or the logical consequence of that poor behaviour. A student is loud and disruptive in the TV room, ask what will fix it. They can't use the TV room for a period of time. So we've got another activity here, and this is an example. Provide an example of a natural consequence, and a logical consequence. We want to look at negative consequences and the different types, and I guess the hierarchy of those negative consequences. So the first of those is probably going to be a sign or a signal from the boarding supervisor in response to a behaviour. So it might be a raised stop hand or an index finger to the lips to request quiet. Or the second type could be a short verbal. So it's a brief comment given in response to a behaviour, reminding the young person of the correct behaviour. We don't run in the hall, we walk in the hall. Correction. A student is required to correctly display the required behaviour. If the young person runs down the hall, have them return and walk instead, give them an opportunity to do it right. And then restitution. A young person is required to correct the result of negative behaviour. If the young person breaks something, then they're required to repair it or pay for the cost of replacing it. Loss of privilege. The young person loses a privilege. Young person uses their phone late at night in breach of the phone use agreement. For a week, they're required to hand their phone in at bedtime. Time out. The young person is removed from the activity or location. A student is loud and disruptive when other students are watching a movie. The student is required to leave the theatre and sit in the office. Task. The young person's allocated a task or an additional duty in response to poor behaviour. If a student's swearing and using abusive language, the student is required to carry out 1 hour of a cleaning task. Note, the students are aware that if they use abusive language, then the consequence will be additional duties. A conference with the head of boarding or the principal. The young person is involved in a conference with senior staff to discuss their behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. When asked to leave the TV room and go to bed, the student refuses to follow instructions and remained in the TV room for another 10 minutes. This same behaviour had occurred on previous occasions. The student is required to attend a conference with senior staff to develop strategies to change their behaviour. So you can see how this is a hierarchy, and there's more serious behaviours and there are more serious consequences. A conference with parents. As a result of serious negative behaviour, the student is involved in a conference with senior staff and the student's parents or guardians to discuss behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. So, for example, a student has brought alcohol to the residence, shared it with other students who became intoxicated. The student is required to attend a meeting with the head of boarding and their parents to discuss the incident and any further consequences. And then suspension. As a result of a serious negative behaviour, the student is suspended from the boarding residence for a period of time. A student starts a fight and assaults another student, causing injury. The student is suspended from the residence for 2 weeks. Students are aware that assaulting another student will result in a suspension from the residence. So they're the different examples of a hierarchy of consequences, and I'm sure that each organisation will have something similar. Probably won't be exactly the same, but it'll be something similar. There are guidelines for using negative consequences, and there's 10 of these, but they are important. Here are the 10 guidelines. Number 1, make it clear what the problem behaviour is and what the consequence is for that behaviour. Number 2, only implement negative consequences if positive interventions aren't succeeding, and use the least restrictive consequence to achieve change. Number 3, use negative consequences as a teaching tool, not a punishing tool, and only use consequences that are safe and respect dignity and basic rights. Number 4, be consistent. The severity of the consequence is not as important as its certainty. Students won't learn if they sometimes get away with something. If you react to behaviours in consistent ways with the same consequences, that's a lot more effective. Choose a consequence that will bring change, so the best outcome for the student will always be achieved. Do not just give them what they want. So for example, you might have a student in the homework room and they are misbehaving because they find the work very difficult and they don't want to do it. So What they want is for you to send them out of the homework room so they don't have to continue doing the homework. So that's not going to help them. That's not going to be a good long-term outcome for the students. So don't give them just what they want. Give them something that will bring change. Don't use consequences in isolation. Also use strategies that motivate the young person towards new and positive behaviours. Number 7 is deliver the consequence, don't just threaten. Number 8, be careful about when and how consequences are delivered. Don't give the consequence in public in front of their peers. Number 9, deliver the consequence, the negative consequence, in a calm, matter-of-fact way. Showing emotion will cause the student to react emotionally and not think about what they've done. They're less likely to learn from the consequence. 10, where possible, include parents in the decision, particularly about higher level consequences. Functional behaviour assessment. A functional behaviour assessment identifies when, where and why serious behaviours of concern happen. In schools, this is called a function of the behaviour. The information is then used to develop a behaviour intervention plan or something similar. You might have these processes in your organisation, but they're called a slightly different name. But that's what the official name is for this material. When do you conduct a functional behaviour assessment? An FBA may be carried out when a young person's behaviour gets in the way of their learning or in the way of what they're doing in boarding, gets in the way of the learning or the activity or the experience of other students or boarders, and it can cause harm to themselves or others. An assessment can be conducted as often as needs be. The assessment process to do an FBA does not require specific qualifications, but if the behaviour poses a serious risk, it is better to engage a psychologist, a behavioural specialist, or a behaviour analyst. The steps are: identify the problem and define the behaviour, gather information about the events and consequence, analyse the data to determine why the young person is involved in the behaviour. After the assessment, plan interventions to change the behaviour, create a behaviour support plan, implement the plan, and then evaluate whether it's worked or not. Sources of information for the assessment would come from a review of the young person's school or boarding records, interviews with staff and caregivers, structured rating scales, collection of direct observation data, identification of any health and well-being concerns, and consideration of the environmental conditions that might impact behaviours of concern. Indirect assessments might involve an interview, questionnaire, or rating scale. They may provide the situation and specific times that the behaviour is most likely to occur. Direct assessment might involve observing the behaviour under naturally occurring conditions without changing or manipulating the environment. A behaviour intervention plan is based on the results of a functional behaviour assessment, and it includes a description of the behaviour, theories or explanations as to why it occurred, and intervention strategies. A BIP has got components such as skills training, change of the environment, strategies to encourage appropriate behaviour, the support needed, and collecting data to measure progress. Okay, so we want to have a look at this activity, and this next activity asks you to list your hierarchy of consequences. So you might need to think this through, and I know that one of the problems for boarding residents is that they do tend to rely on just one or two main types of consequences, and this is not very effective. And in reality, they probably do have lots of other choices or options. So if you can list down your hierarchy of consequences from the very lowest consequence, which is probably going to be like a sign to a young person or a quiet word to a young person, right up to a young person being suspended or expelled. Thank you. Bit of nice sharing behaviour there. In responding to student behaviour, we want to look at restorative practice. Just a quick overview. Restorative practice is a positive approach that works with students rather than doing things to them or for them. And you can see that in this restorative window. Restorative practice promotes self-regulation. It encourages behaviour that's supportive and respectful. It helps a young person be accountable for their behaviour and to repair any harm caused. It's not a blame and punish approach. It avoids scolding, judging, lecturing or blaming. It accepts that we all make mistakes and we can all fix up the problem. We can learn from our experience. There's a lot of questions involved, and some of these questions make us think about the consequences, and they can elicit empathy, remorse and learning. Questions like, who has been affected by what has happened? So typically these are the restorative questions. When things go wrong, particularly in relationships, what has happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by what you've done? What do you think you need to do to make things right? And this form here, Tell Your Story, is a part of this, just telling what actually happened. When working restoratively, you avoid interrogation. You ask specific questions that encourage reflection and problem solving, opportunities to understand the impact of behaviour on others, and recognise that in some situation there are no quick fixes and might require time and support to see those positive behaviours eventuate. There is a continuum of strategies, a little tiny bit like a hierarchy of consequences, and it goes from informal conversations right up to conferencing at the more serious end. We now want to look at addressing aggressive and violent behaviour. We should be trying to anticipate this sort of behaviour, aggressive behaviour, before it occurs, by being observant and engaged, alert to signs of tension, knowing the students and knowing the triggers. Some actions or events might trigger a student's poor or challenging behaviour, and we talked about this before, a student having learning difficulties, so study time might trigger those negative behaviours. Teasing might trigger a student to fight or flight. To anticipate aggressive behaviour before it occurs, notice signs of tension, body language, noise level, etc. Know the students, have that relationship with students, and know their triggers. Hostile communication, where somebody's shouting at you or abusive towards you verbally. It's important to remain calm. Very often this is not personal. It's not a personal attack. So we need to remain calm and respond professionally. Try to have empathy for the person and don't take it personally. Now we want to look at de-escalation strategies, and there's quite a few of these, but they're all important. They're all very important, and it's important, I think, to go over these again and again, and just to be really aware of what is the right sort of thing to do when a person is escalated or when they are starting to escalate. So remove anything or any person causing the aggression. So if there is somebody causing the aggression, well, remove them so that can't continue. Do not block or corner people who are upset. So don't corner them in an office or anything like that. Keep at least 2 arms lengths away from a person. That way you seem less of a threat to them. Keep an open body posture. Don't appear to be hiding anything. Again, it's about appearing a threat. Keep body posture relaxed. And I know sometimes this is hard because these can be very tense, even fearful situations. But our gestures, facial expressions and movements, they should all be relaxed. Try to keep body language neutral. Remain calm, rational and professional. Ask the young person what would make them feel safe or what would make them feel better. Ask what could help or what could happen next. Don't be judgmental. Be low and slow. That's low in your body, so your body should be at the same height as the young person, and your voice should be low, and your language, the speed of your talking should be slow. So low and slow is important. Name it to tame it. So naming the emotions can help the young person gain control. I can see you're feeling angry, that sort of thing. Use the approach regulate over educate. So don't be trying to educate the young person during this de-escalation process. There's time for that later. Ignore challenging questions. Give the person space and time. Validate the person during and after. And I think we understand that the whole process of de-escalation takes time. It takes time for a young person to de-escalate, probably as much as 30 minutes at least. And so we need to allow time for that to happen. We want to talk now about physical restraint and intervention. Restraint is the use of physical force to prevent, restrict, or subdue the movement of a person's body or part of their body, so the student is not free to move away when they're being restrained. Physical intervention is physical contact to block, deflect, or redirect a student's actions or disengage a student's grips, but they can move away. So there's this two quite different things: restraint and intervention. Physical restraint should only be used in exceptional circumstances. And in my whole teaching career, and for many of those years I was a school principal, probably 25 years, I only used physical restraint probably 2 or 3 times in all of those years. So where do you use it? Where there's real and immediate danger of injury to the student or to others. And so one of those times I was in a woodwork class and a student raised a wood chisel, and was about to stab another student. So I needed to intervene and physically restrain this student so the other student didn't get hurt. So where there is real and immediate risk of injury to the student or to others, where the restraint is a reasonable response to prevent harm. So I basically restricted his arm. I think if you had thrown him to the floor or something like that, that would not be a reasonable response. And so this other point here, there is no less restrictive measure available in the circumstances. So where there's real and immediate risk of injury to the student or to other students or to staff members, where the restraint is a reasonable response to prevent harm, and where there's no less restrictive measure available in the circumstances. You should not use physical restraint or intervention if there's a risk of injury to yourself, and make sure that all of your actions are consistent with your organisation's policies and procedures. So you should be aware of your organisation's policies and procedures, and make sure that your behaviour, the physical restraint and intervention, is consistent with those policies and procedures. Most organisations prohibit restraint that covers a student's mouth or nose or in any way interferes with breathing, that takes a student to the ground into the prone or supine position, that applies pressure to the neck, back, chest or joints, that applies pain to gain compliance, that intentionally causes a student to fall, that includes a person sitting, lying or kneeling on a student. So most organisations prohibit physical restraint that does any of those things. After physical restraint, provide support for the student and the staff involved. People can be quite stressed by this. And so we need to provide support, and sometimes even professional support. Report the incident to the head of boarding or the school principal. Document the incident in the student's record. Just make sure that it's thoroughly documented. Notify parents and carers, and then review the incident for alternative actions and any preventative or de-escalation strategies that might reduce the likelihood of it happening again. So just reviewing the incident. Could we have done this differently? Is there a better way to have done it? And coming up with some conclusions about physical restraint and a particular incident. Okay, so that's the end of this video. There is one more part to the activity. This says, if you're training another person to de-escalate a student, what are the important things you want them to know? So what are the really important things that you want them to know if they're going to be in a position where they're de-escalating a student? Thank you very much.